And and also I drove down here for 3 hours and so my rear end hurts. I'm going to try to quote here from the Declaration of Independence, and if I mess it up a little bit, I'm sure somebody will Google it and tell me so, but here it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That last line I'd like to emphasize here, the consent of the governed. That describes a system we often refer to rather loosely as democracy, right? Everybody likes democracy, right? Sounds good, right? Democracy means the rule of the people, right? The consent of the governed. So I guess we all have to consent. I'd like to do a little experiment here. Well, first of all, I'd like to say, in a democracy, how do we express our opinions? I heard someone say here in a minute. Through voting, right? Okay, here's the experiment. Now, everyone do this with me now. Just raise your hand. Raise your hand, come on, one hand, please. Everyone's got a hand, right? Okay, good. Now, if you are under 21, drop that hand. If you are not a citizen of the United States, now drop that hand. Your hand is not up. There we are. Drop that hand. Okay? Now, it's just a little harder. If you are not white, drop that hand. Oh boy, we're losing some people here. Oh, here's another one. If you are not male, drop that hand. I'm looking around the room here now. How many people get to vote? Okay, you and you. We're in charge, guys. Don't worry the rest of you, because we're going to take good care of you. Everything's going to be fair. Oh, I forgot one other wait a second. Three guys, three white guys, hands up. How many of us, if you don't own any property, okay, you're gone, pal. Okay. You still got property? I can't think of any other way to knock you out, so I guess I'm going to have to deal with you too. I like to tell my students that back in 1787, when we officially started this show, because remember we were born in 1776, and I just quoted from our birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence, but we didn't actually get our acts together and have a government until 1787, when we had a constitution, right? And as of 1787, that was pretty much how things went. White, male, over 21, property owning. And you can see from your personal experience this evening how that cuts things down, doesn't it? So who gets to vote in this supposed democracy of ours, or as we sometimes call it, our republic, our representative democracy? Who gets to vote? Pretty big issue, isn't it? So when those guys got together, incidentally, 55, oh, that would be rich white guys, property-owning white guys anyway, like me. When those guys got together and they wrote up the first part of our Constitution, the first 7 articles before we started the Bill of Rights thing and amending it, what did they say about voting? Anyone know? Like almost nothing. Effectively, in Article 1 of the Constitution, they basically said, we'll leave it to the states. Why? Probably because it was too contentious. Probably because there were big differences between the states. In fact, at that time, some states did let black folk vote. Some states even let women vote some. Some states let foreigners vote. Some states, basically, they open up the polls and anybody who showed up, they hand them a glass of whiskey, say, vote for me, and then, oh, you think I'm kidding? No, candidates would have big barrels of whiskey there. James Madison almost lost his first election because he didn't supply whiskey. He never made that mistake again. They didn't have voter ID cards then. So who gets to vote was something that was essentially left to the states by Article 1 of the Constitution, and that worked fairly well, I guess, for a while, with the rather big exception of most of the people in this room. As the 18th century turned into the 19th century, the big issue, of course, was slavery. And although the first 7 articles of the Constitution don't mention the S word, they certainly took into account slavery, didn't they? They certainly had provisions in there where they referred sort of obliquely to people held to service and how they had to be returned to the people to whom they owed that service upon the demand. That's the Fugitive Slave Clause. There were also references to representational voting being adjusted for 3/5 of all other persons. The infamous 3/5 clause, right? Now, that's a bad clause. I'm not going to defend it, but it's not bad for the reasons you think it is. People will say, well, the original Constitution said black folk were only worth 3/4 of a white person. Actually, it was the Southerners who wanted more than 3/5. The Southerners wanted black folk to count for 100% of a white person. It was the Northern people who didn't want them to count for anything, because the Northern people didn't want the Southern people to get more power based upon counting people who couldn't vote. So in other words, the Southerners, the slave states, were saying we want more representation in Congress based upon all the people who live in our states, even though we're not letting them vote. And in some states, that was roughly half of the population. I'm thinking of South Carolina. Half of the population was disenfranchised. And yet they wanted to count them in order to determine how many representatives they had in Congress. And of course, that, through the Electoral College, has a big effect on who gets to be president. So it's a bad clause. It's about slavery, but not for exactly the reasons most people think. Fast forward. Had the one and only war we've ever had about the Constitution. It was a constitutional war. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It was about equality. It was about slavery. Now you'll hear people say it was about states' rights. Okay, I always say, well, that's fine. The states' rights to do what? Okay, that would be to have slaves, right? And if you really think about it, many of the southern states were angry because they were angry at the northern states, the so-called free states, because those free states were saying, hey, we're not going to be returning your slaves to you. When they come here, they're free. So what about the states' rights to have freedom? Okay, states' rights is one of those things that people believe in when it's to their convenience to believe in it. The war was about slavery. Sure, it was also about preserving the Union because half of the Union had left because of slavery. So it was a war about the fact that we were not living up to those soaring terms in our birth certificate and our Declaration of Independence. Written, as we all know, by Thomas Jefferson, who, but we'll skip over Sally Hemings and all that for the moment. We are a nation of contradictions. In fact, I like to describe our constitutional history as setting high bars and then struggling and struggling and struggling to live up to them. And yes, as Joe just said so eloquently, that struggle is continuing today. Civil War, 3 big amendments to the Constitution result. The 13th, who knows what that did? No more slavery. Exactly. People say the Emancipation Proclamation did. Not quite true. Limitations, really a war measure pursuant to Article 2, the President's Commander-in-Chief powers. Very important. But no, it took an amendment to the Constitution to get rid of all those oblique references to slaves. Speaking of which, do you know who didn't want to ratify that original Constitution? Who was really against it? It was the Quakers. They called that original Constitution a pact with death because of its implicit approval of slavery. It was a pro-slavery Constitution. And there were people who pointed that out. We had a Civil War, and now we're going to amend it. We're going to fix it. 13th, no more slavery. What's the 14th do? Come on now. Right. Pardon me? Right. Almost. That's the next one. That's a hint. 14th, equal protection. The first time the word equal appears in the Constitution. Do you know that? 1868, the first time the word equal appears in the Constitution. Also declared that everybody born here are naturalized as a citizen. Also said that no state can deny due process of law to any person. Big amendment, very important. And then the 15th was voting. 15th was voting rights for African American men. Sorry, ladies. As my wife often points out, you were the last ones. I'm sorry. But at least all men would be equal. as of the 15th Amendment. What was interesting about these three amendments was not only what they did, and by the way, what they did turned the original Constitution on its head. It was such a big deal that constitutional scholars will call that the Second American Constitution, or the Second American Constitutional Founding. It was big. Don't let anybody tell you differently. What was interesting about those three amendments, if you ever look them up, and I hope you will, I hope at some point everybody in this room will read through that whole Constitution. It'll take an hour or two. It's readable. You can understand most of it. If you don't understand the rest of it, you can come to my class. You can listen to my radio show, and we'll talk about the rest of it. Each one of those amendments had as its final section a variation on this. Congress shall have the power by appropriate legislation to enforce the provisions of this amendment. That language, that Congress was specifically given the power to enforce those three amendments, 13, 14, and 15, had never appeared before in the Constitution. And it was there very specifically because people had said, gosh, we can abolish slavery, but how are we going to make sure it doesn't come back? Gosh, we can say everyone's equal, but how are we going to make sure? Are we going to leave that to Alabama? Or to Mississippi? Or Virginia? Or Tennessee? Are we going to do that? They made it very clear that Congress had the power to enforce no slavery, equal protection, and voting rights. And guess what? For about 10 years, they did. It was called Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction has a bad name. Reconstruction has been vilified. Reconstruction has been described as a terrible period in our history. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you something. I know it's going to shock you. Gone with the Wind is not a documentary. Now, I've enjoyed that film. I've seen it several times. I didn't see it till I was in college. My girlfriend was from Alabama. She said, "You've never seen Gone with the Wind? That's my favorite movie." Okay, well, let's go. I turned back to her and I said, "Really?" But it's a really good movie. I read the book. A little melodramatic, but it's a good story. Scarlett O'Hara, she's so tough, she's going to stand up. I'll never be hungry again. Okay, well, I understand that. Sort of a feminist thing. Okay, that's cool. But did you notice that the black folk were either the ones who were the happy slaves, they were the good ones, or then there were the ones who were, I believe the word was uppity, the ones who didn't get off the sidewalk, didn't act that way. It was a remarkable book, and it shows us the power of literature in our constitutional debate. That movie has done more damage to our constitutional order than any other single work of art as far as people will talk about Birth of a Nation, that very famous Ku Klux Klan film, what was it, 1915? Okay, fine, film historian, but who actually watches that anymore, right? You can find it on YouTube. Watch a bunch of guys in sheets walk, in a silent movie. Ooh, that's important. Okay, but nobody watches it. Gone with the Wind, people still do. They have parties, Gone with the Wind parties. That's influence. And that fundamentally affected how we saw that period. But I'm telling you, Reconstruction, with all of its imperfections, and everything's imperfect, represented roughly 10 years, from roughly 1865 to 1877, of at least an attempt to live up to this new constitutional order, and at least to have some kind of civil rights for former slaves. And Congress actually passed what they call enforcement acts, and even in 1875, something called the Civil Rights Act of 1875, forgive me, 1875, toward the tail end of Reconstruction. If you read the provisions of that act, it practically says you can't exclude black folk from lunch counters. I'm not kidding you. They didn't use the word lunch counters, but they said you can't exclude people because of color, because of previous condition of servitude from public accommodations, such as, it was 90 years earlier, it was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the penalty, if you did that, was that the person you discriminated against could get $500 from you, which back then was a lot of money. You could be fined up to $1,000, which was, twice as much money, and put in jail for up to a year. This was an act with teeth, and it was backed up by federal troops. with guns and bayonets in the South, and then Reconstruction ended. It ended for a variety of reasons, but the proximate cause was a deal where there was a tie in the Electoral College. Remember the Electoral College I told you about and all those Southern votes? Well, they got themselves a tie. It was Tilden versus Hayes. Tilden had more popular votes. Hayes cut a deal. He said, you Southerners, you vote for me, I'll end Reconstruction. They did, he did, and he pulled the troops out. And guess what happened? Oh yes, you know the rest of that story, don't you? That's when the black codes were enacted. That's when the Supreme Court refused to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Specifically refused to enforce it, saying it does not allow Congress to do the things it did. That's when Jim Crow started. And that's when many historians will tell you we hit the low point in race relations in this country. Now, that's odd to think, isn't it? You think anything's better than slavery. But slavery was at least a known quantity. And within that terrible, horrible institution, people could get along on a daily basis, at least on the surface. But after emancipation, and as black folk actually tried to live out the equality they'd been promised, that's when the Klan came in. The first Klan was during Reconstruction. It was Nathan Bedford Forrest. You've heard of him, that great Confederate, that guy, with the cavalry and all that. Yeah, the guy who had a really interesting way of taking care of prisoners of war, especially black prisoners of war, and that is he would take out his pistol and shoot them in the face. You've heard of Fort Pillow, where he massacred black Union troops. That's who founded the Ku Klux Klan. It kind of went away after Reconstruction ended because they didn't need to. I mean, the guys who'd been running the Klan were now running the governments. You don't need the Klan anymore. It didn't come back until the era I'm talking about, and it really had its renaissance in the 1920s. We call it the Second Klan sometimes. And those guys were nasty. Because again, you had people of color trying to say, what about that 13th Amendment, that 14th, and that 15th Amendment, that voting rights thing? Can I come vote? What about that? That's when the lynchings were happening in great numbers. That's when people were being beaten and raped and killed and terrorized. It's a terrorist organization. You know the general history of the civil rights era, and we don't have time to go over it all, so we're skipping over a lot. But then we come to an era where several things happened. Of course, it was the black leaders themselves. We all heard the story about the returning veterans from World War II. We've heard about Martin Luther King.
May I have your attention, please?
Sure you can.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes.
Sorry. We'll try to get out. Got it. I'm going to hurry up real quick. You've heard of Thurgood Marshall. Okay, you've heard of all these great names from this era. There's another name that sometimes gets maligned because of his background and because of his accent and because of the way he would toss off the N-word casually. That was Lyndon Johnson. Through an accident of politics and a tragedy, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, he found himself in office and able for the first time to use the incredible legislative skills he had developed as the leader of the Senate to push through this remarkable legislation of the mid-1960s. The first thing he did, the first major legislation, was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which mirrored the Civil Rights Act of 1875, almost 90 years later. He got that done and was scared to death because now he's thinking, I got an election to face here and I'm going to lose. But guess what? He got a landslide in 1964, and he controlled, Democrats at least, controlled both houses of Congress. The very first thing he did, and I'm going to use a little bit of harsh language here because I know you've heard it before. I hope I don't offend anybody, but he turned to Nicholas Katzenbach, who was his Attorney General. He said, I want you to write the goddamnedest, strictest Voting Rights Act you can think of. And he did. And they had it ready to go. And then he started balancing, as he always did, what his priorities were, and he was also trying to enact something called the Great Society. And that's where a bit of strategic dispute arose between Johnson on the one side and the people getting their heads beaten in places like Selma on the other. And I have not seen the film Selma yet, but I'm disheartened by what I've heard is the misrepresentation of the relationship between King and Johnson. In fact, the reason I can say that with some confidence is because apparently Andrew Young says that's the only thing he doesn't like about the movie. Johnson and King might have differed into precisely when Johnson was going to introduce this act and precisely how it was going to happen. But it wasn't Johnson fighting King because he didn't believe in him. Johnson believed in King. Johnson believed in civil rights. After Abraham Lincoln, he's the greatest civil rights president in our history. Fascinating multi-volume biography of Johnson by Robert Caro. I highly recommend it if you're interested in these things. But finally, we come to the act. Voting Rights Act of 1965 proposed in March of 1965, right after King decided, I'm going ahead in Selma. He did lead that because Johnson was saying, hold off just a little while longer, hold off a little while longer. I've got these other things I need to do first, then we'll do voting rights. King said, no, we're going to Selma. So he did. He forced Johnson's hand, but when Johnson had his hand forced, he said, okay, I'm introducing the legislation that I had Katzenbach do months ago. So they bring it forward, and they pass it. And by August of 1965, we finally have taken Section 2 of the 15th Amendment that says Congress shall have the authority through appropriate legislation to enforce this, and we've got what Johnson had called the goddamnedest, strictest Voting Rights Act ever. And now you got a president in office who's willing to stand behind it and enforce it. Now, what's happened since that time? I'm going to get a little bit boring here because the details of these things are always kind of boring and technical. But here's one of the things the Voting Rights Act did. It said, look, voting's a problem everywhere, so we're going to outlaw discrimination everywhere. That's Section 2. But there are certain parts of the country where it's a bit more of a problem than others, right? Okay, there's racism everywhere, but Jim Crow was in the South. So we're going to look at those areas where voting has been most suppressed, and we're going to say these areas have special rules. These areas are going to come under special supervision, and whenever they want to change their voting rules at all, even changing the location of a polling place, they have to go to the Justice Department or to the District of Columbia Court and get pre-approval. It was actually called pre-clearance. It set up a formula in Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act and said, if you're one of these places that has been using tricks and things like poll taxes and literacy taxes and grandfather clauses to keep black folk away from the polls.
What you said.
You're not sure what I said? I'm sorry, I'll try to be clear this time. If you're one of those places that's been doing that, and if you've been doing it so much that you got less than 50% of your people even voting, then you're one of these covered jurisdictions. And that included entire states, it included counties within states. They had a formula. Section 4B set up the formula. Section 5 said you have to get pre-clearance. That provision was intended to be temporary, 5 years. But then Congress would come back in 1970, and in 1975, in 1982, and ultimately in 2006. They kept saying, you know, there's still a problem. It's still primarily these areas. They tweaked it a bit, but we're going to continue this. The last time they did that was in 2006. And they extended it, I think, to 2031. Don't quote me on that. I think it was about that length of time. It was about 25 years. So we're going to keep doing this because there are still problems in a lot of these areas. And that's the recent case, Shelby Township. Shelby Township, Alabama didn't like that. Shelby Township said, you're singling us out. Shelby Township said, Shelby County, Alabama said, we're not like that anymore. And we're challenging this. We're saying that that exceeds Congress's enforcement power under the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court of the United States in 2013 agreed with them. It didn't like the idea of treating some states and some counties differently than the other states. It said that data is outdated. We're gutting Section 4B. Your formula is gone. It said, of course, if Congress wants to come back and come up with a new formula, go ahead. Section 5 is still there. There's still a pre-clearance procedure, but there's no formula to determine who's covered by it. What do you think the chances are current Congress is going to come up with a new formula? Immediately after the Shelby County case was announced, immediately after, 2 states, I think they were Texas and Mississippi, who had been covered jurisdictions previously, proposed and I believe enacted voter ID laws that had been rejected by the Justice Department under the pre-clearance regime. And look around you, what's happened in the last 2 years? More and more laws that almost any impartial observer will tell you are solutions looking for a problem. There is no widespread problem of voter fraud in this country. There are not a lot of people out there fraudulently trying to vote at the polls. So why are all these things being enacted? I'll let you make up your mind on that, but many of them would not have made it past pre-clearance. Now, it's still true, under the Voting Rights Act, that if you feel that your local, county, or state is infringing upon your voting rights, you can sue them. But that's a lot harder, isn't it? You gotta go find a lawyer, you gotta pay the lawyer, you gotta wait years for a decision. Many people say that when the Supreme Court decided the Shelby County case and gutted Section 4B, the formula, that they gutted the whole Voting Rights Act. Well, the Voting Rights Act is still there, but it's not what it used to be. That's a very brief history of voting rights. That's a brief discussion of the Voting Rights Act and its most recent iteration. Thank you very much for your attention.